processes that are forming a key part of our industrial technology timber course. Now, when we're talking about processes in this set of slides, I'm really going to focus on some of the non-traditional processes that you wouldn't yet be familiar with from your in-classes experiences. So don't be surprised if you're learning completely new stuff today, and that's the whole purpose of this, so that you can use that then as research to transfer into your folio when required. Now, if we're looking at what our goals are, we're looking at trying to know a range of processes that are used in the furniture making industry and how they can be used to enhance a project further, to make it considered to be higher difficulty. And when we do that, the idea is that you start to understand what techniques are high degree of difficulty, because this high degree of difficulty that you can see there is really what's going to help you push the boundaries in terms of your project, in terms of practical skills, and in terms of then your achievement of marks in an assessment criteria, but also in terms of client satisfaction if we're thinking industry application. And then what you should be able to do is actually go off and complete the research of the processes in your folios for your upcoming timber assessment tasks if required. So we'll start with laser engraving. Laser engraving would be considered to be a fairly moderate level skill. It's not super easy, but it's also not the most challenging skill we've got. Now on the screen there you can see an example of laser engraving, and what you would imagine if we're looking at the lighter coloured table on the right hand side, you would imagine that's made from some sort of pine timber, which is the light yellowy colour. And then when the laser on the laser cutter runs past, it's actually burning the timber very lightly, which is creating that darker pattern. So that darker pattern you're seeing are actually burn marks. Okay? On the opposite project you can see there, they've done the same sort of process, but it looks to me like they've had a stain in the timber, so they're working with a stained version of the light timber, so that when they've burnt through, it's actually brought that lighter colour back out and have sanded the burn marks off. So instead of leaving the black behind, they've definitely sanded the burn marks off there. Okay. Typically, if you're laser engraving on a laser cutter, you're going to get black burning marks. So to get the lighter colours, once it's etched in, they're then going through and sanding that off to reveal the lighter colour. Now, in terms of the tools and machinery required for a project like this, there's really a requirement that you are able to use CAD software and or a graphic illustration bit of software. Then, once you've got your file prepared, the laser cutter is then doing the work for you. So the reason this isn't considered to be a high skill is because in terms of traditional woodworking skills, you're not actually doing anything yourself with the timber other than putting it into the laser cutting machine. It's really your design-based skills in either a program like SketchUp, if we're thinking CAD software, or if we're thinking illustration software, could be Adobe Illustrator, and you're using those line-based drawings to then produce a design that the laser cutter can produce. Now, it's really important you understand here when we're talking graphic illustration, we are not talking about getting a photo from the internet and etching that in. We're talking about actually designing drawings that are based on lines as opposed to pixels. So vector-based artwork versus bitmap-based artwork. Now, there's quite a lot of skill in CAD. However, it's one of those skills that you will have demonstrated elsewhere in your project, potentially through your drawings, as you're progressing those from your simple basic drawings in SketchUp as a 3D model in isometric through to your more complex annotated and dimensioned orthographic drawings. And for that reason, this is considered to be a moderate level skill. Okay, so yes, there's some skill in CAD, but not so many skills in timber, so we're sitting in the middle ground there. If we're looking down the Marquetry path, Marquetry is a old school timber technique that sort of has come back now that we have tools available like the laser cutter, because you can get a level of precision that wasn't necessarily as achievable for students in the past. However, you can achieve these same designs using either a laser cutter or a bandsaw or a coping saw or a jigsaw or a scroll saw or any other sort of saw that enables you to cut shape. So it's really not one of those skills that's limited to very new machinery. It's definitely something that's an old traditional skill. Now, the skills that you're showing here is your ability to firstly design a pattern of some sort. Now, if we're looking at Marquetry, we're really looking at these geometric patterns that we can see there. And we're also looking at cutting skills, and gluing skills, and then of course there's your generic sanding and finishing skills. But this actual project here is all built around cutting shapes that then fit together a little bit like a puzzle there. Now, when we're talking about degree of difficulty, because it's really more design and cutting based, it would be considered a fairly low level skill. However, you can compare the image on the right, which is less challenging, to the image on the left, which obviously has a lot more complicated structures and shapes in there that all fit together quite well. That would be considered to be a much more complex and would be leaning moderate up into high even. Okay, so it really does depend on the complexity of the design, but in terms of the time available for us in our standard projects in our school workshops, something like what you can see on the left is usually not something that's available to a year 9 or 10 level student because of the time it would take to do that. However, a student for a major work that's got a 9-month, 12-month sort of window to work on very much could be an achievable project, pushing up to that high level of difficulty. In a similar vein to that, we've got Inlay. Now, when we look at Marquetry, we're really thinking about, I'll just go back here, we're really thinking about these geometric patterns, okay, made from nice veneers of timber sitting across the top of solid timber. When we're looking at Inlay, we're really looking at solid timber being cut and then another piece of solid timber actually being laid into the gap that's available, hence the term inlaying. You're laying timber inside of timber, okay? Solid timber in solid timber. Now, tools and machinery for this, we're looking at using routers or trimmers, usually to cut the grooves out. So I'll just see if I can turn some sort of pointer on here. Okay. If we're looking here, between this line here and this line here, where you've got this pattern, that's actually a trench that would have been cut out of the timber in some way. Now, that could have been cut on a table saw, it could have been cut on a bandsaw, but it may also have been cut with a router or a trimmer. So the little spinning, rotating blade to get a nice consistent trench along the length. Once you've then got these opening voids or trenches, you can then get a piece of timber that's cut to size to fit perfectly inside of them. So again, the skills we're looking here, cutting, gluing and design-based skills. Obviously the complexity of your design is going to change the complexity of the skill that you're demonstrating. But if we're looking at the one on the screen, I'd say that's a fairly delicate level of detail, particularly in here when we're seeing the light and the dark timber. If they were actually separate pieces of timber, each of those little squares, which I would assume they are for inlaying, then that would be considered to be fairly technical and fairly difficult, and they've got a nice consistent pattern the whole way across. And the person designing this has really thought about the way they're going to lay timber over timber to create this beautiful pattern. So that would be considered to be up the higher end of the difficulty scale. However, if we're thinking back to some of the projects we've done in the past, for example, if we're thinking of a chopping board, or we're thinking of a coffee table we might have made in class where you route a channel out and drop a single piece of timber in just one long straight strip, that would be considered to be a very low level skill that's being demonstrated there, and as a result isn't really going to be pushing your project to the end. You may be seeing as we're going through these that the degree of difficulty depends on the degree of difficulty of the design. So the more complex the design, the harder the skill is to demonstrate, because it becomes more technical and more precise. Okay, now I do have a video here. I'm not going to play it for you because there's no necessary reason to do that in this particular podcast, but these will be linked in the comments of our YouTube video. So if you just scroll down, you'll be able to see them. I've also got the links there you can have a look at. But this guy here, he's a bit of an expert in terms of woodworking, and he's got some really good tips here on how to put some custom inlays into your projects. So that's from a guy called Steve Ramsey, and he's from Woodworking from Mere Mortals. Fantastic video. I recommend you have a look at that. Like I said, the link's sitting in the description of the YouTube video for you. Move across to the next skill. Our next skill now is lacquering. Now, we quite often will hear different terms in terms of finishes. Specifically talking about lacquering in this process. You can be using oils, you can be using varnishes, you can be using shellacs, you can be using a whole heap of different finished products, but effectively the tools, the skills and the difficulty remain the same. So tools and machinery required for things like this: paint brushes or cloths, or it could be, instead of a paintbrush, it could be a foam roller or a foam brush in that sense as well. A cloth or an old rag, the actual finish that you're preparing to use. So again, the shellacs, the oils, the the polyurethanes, all of these sorts of things, as well as your sanders. Now, what you're demonstrating in your ability to do lacquering is you're demonstrating that you're able to finish a project. So you've got the construction sorted, and this is one single set of skills where you are sanding and applying a sealer to your project. Now, when you're applying a seal, you're adding moisture back to timber, so the timber will start to expand as it starts to accept that moisture, and what will happen particularly on the surface is you get little bits of grain will start to flick up, and that's called raising the grain. In raising the grain, your timber is no longer smooth anymore, so after each coat of a lacquer, until the timber has been completely filled with moisture and sealed off, after each coat you do another sand again, a very light sand, just to bring it back to that smooth level. Now, sanding and applying lacquer considered to be a very low level in terms of difficulty. However, there are plenty of ways that you can make mistakes, so it's definitely something you want to do further research on, the specific way to apply the product that you're working with in class. Or in your project, sorry. My favourite application is using a cloth to get it applied nice and evenly, particularly if I'm using an oil, so that I can get that real consistency and make sure that it gets accepted into the grain from all different directions. It also avoids stroke marks, it also avoids little hairs from the brush falling off, or little bits of fluff and things like that as well. Low level difficulty, but it obviously adds to your project to enhance the overall quality, so even though low level of difficulty, not something you'd want to skip past. Staining is in the same vein. Staining is when you're trying to get a lighter coloured timber to look like a darker coloured timber effectively, and usually the reason you would apply a stain to a project is purely so you can make it look like a timber species that you haven't actually used. Now, if I'm thinking about our workshop experiences, we typically use pine because it's cheap, it's readily available, it's sustainably forested. There's a whole heap of reasons why we use pine in our projects, but it's a light coloured timber. The benefit of light coloured timbers is if you have stained it, you can make it look like any of the hardwoods that are much more expensive, including exotic species that may not be available anymore. Now again, when we're talking about staining, paintbrushes, cloths, finishes, sanders, same sort of skills, same skills being demonstrated, sanding, finishing and staining. What you're going to see here is strangely degree of difficulty is slightly higher. So if I go back, lacquering was considered to be a low level skill. Staining, I would say, is leaning towards the moderate because there's so many more chances for errors to happen here. When you're staining a light coloured timber with a darker colour stain, if you don't apply it correctly, it's going to be really obvious because you might have a pine coloured patch in the middle of your project, or you may have patches where it's blotchy in terms of different degrees of that new colour that you're putting into the timber. It can be done very efficiently as long as you've done the research into how to apply the specific product you're working with. Now, because staining and finishing wood is another one of those really challenging skills, again, I've got a video here, and this is a very simple video, goes through the process and really shows you quite clearly how the raising the grain concept works, how the staining process works, and what happens if you don't follow the appropriate preparation steps, and particularly with stains and with finishes, how glue will interact with your stain and stop it from working the way that you want it. Again, I'm not going to play that today, I'm going to skip past it, but you will be able to see that in the comments for our video. The next process that I've got up on the screen here is bending. Now, bending is one of those techniques that you can do on a very small scale or you can do on a very large scale. We need to accept that timber is a solid. Timber, when it's originally in its pure form, is on a tree, and that tree is usually alive when we start working with it, which means the timber is considered to be green. Green is a term to say that the timber is still living, hasn't yet died, and is also filled with moisture. Now, when the timber is filled with moisture, that means there is water effectively running through what we call the veins of the timber, enabling it to grow, transporting nutrients back and forth from the roots through to the leaves and so on. Now, when we cut a tree down to use in a timber project, we go through this process of seasoning, which is taking all of the moisture or most of the moisture out. In Sydney, when we talk about the appropriate amount of moisture to leave in, we normally talk around about that 15% mark. So you may hear this term equilibrium moisture content, or EMC, and for Sydney we're really looking around that 15% mark. What that actually means in real terms is we have moisture in the air in Sydney. So it's not a really dry environment, but it's not a really steamy environment. If we think tropical rainforest where it's really steamy and really damp, that would be a much higher moisture content in the air. And if we were thinking maybe in some of the desert environments where it's really dry, we might have a lower moisture content in the air. To make sure that our timber stays stable, when we season it so that it has approximately the same amount of moisture in it as the air around it, so that the timber stays fairly stable, straight, no kinks, no bends, no warping, no other defects caused by moisture. That's important for you to understand how bending works, because when you have a tree at home that's still alive and you grab a branch and you pull it, if that branch is still living, the branch will spring, bend and bounce because it's filled with moisture and the fibres in it are able to bend. However, when a tree has been seasoned and that moisture's been taken out, the fibres have stiffened, and so instead of bending like they do when they're green, they will literally just snap and break. And that's why if you have a tree that's got a dead branch on it and you pull it, it simply just snaps off. This is how bending works. If you want timber that is dry to suddenly become flexible again, you need to introduce the moisture back into the timber. And we do this usually by soaking it in water, boiling it in water, or putting it in a really moist environment such as a steam box, where we're artificially adding moisture into the air so that the timber can absorb it. As soon as the timber becomes green again, it becomes a lot more flexible, a lot more pliable, and therefore easier to bend without it breaking, without the fibres snapping off. So, a lot of complexity there in the understanding of how bending works. You can probably see that degree of difficulty is quite high. Now the skills demonstrated here, bending obviously, your ability to clamp a project. Now, if we're looking up here, you can see this piece of timber here, curving all around here, would originally have been a straight length of timber purchased from the shop. They've introduced moisture to it to make it flexible again, and they're now trying to bend it around this sort of contraption in the middle. This contraption in the middle would be referred to as formwork, you can see there, or maybe referred to as your jig, sometimes by people in woodworking. Technically, we'll refer to it as formwork, and this is the shape that we want our now green timber to follow. All these little holes that you can see that have been drilled in are holes so that we can get our clamps to clamp in and hold it into that position. Once you've got your wet green timber and you've got it to the shape you want, you clamp it down to hold it there, and then you leave it for several days until that moisture has dried back out again. So naturally, if you've got wet timber that you've introduced moisture to, and you leave it in Sydney to dry, it should equalise back to around about that 15% moisture mark, because the air is a little bit drier, therefore the air will absorb some of the moisture out of it and bring it back to that 15%. Once it's at 15%, the timber doesn't suddenly straighten up. What it does is actually stiffen, so it will stay roughly in that shape. Okay, so degree of difficulty in this is quite high. Tools and machines, fairly simple to understand, but some really, really complex skills along the way as well. So again, I've got some videos here on steam bending. This is from a YouTuber called The Wood Whisperer, again, one of the experts in woodworking. This video is really good because it goes through a whole heap of processes to explain some trial and error that he's had with reintroducing that moisture to the timber and how he got it to work as well. So I'll leave that one with you to watch on your own. Okay. Again, I've got another video here from the Wood Whisperer on another way that he's done some bending as well. It's not always done with steam. There is another trick you can use, which is getting really thin laminates of timber, so thin layers of timber. And while they are thin, they are obviously a little bit more flexible. And again, that's another way to do some bending. So if you're not doing the steam bending by adding moisture, you can reduce the rigidity of the timber by making it thinner, which makes it a little bit more flexible because there's less fibers. And so that's another video there to help you with that.
Today,
okay. That's the end of that section in terms of processes. Like I said, there are way more processes that you'll be familiar with from your class experiences. This set of slides was really around introducing you to some of those newer processes that you may or not be familiar with. As you can see, our next video is going to be on adhesives, and that's another key part of research that we typically do before we start a project, so that we can make sure that our timber doesn't fall apart into flat pack furniture again after we've completed our projects. Thanks very much, and I look forward to seeing you on our next video.